Trump added new wrinkles into his trade policy on Monday by suggesting he might grant exemptions on auto-related levies already in place. He said he was considering a modification to the 25% tariffs imposed on foreign auto and auto parts imported from Mexico and Canada. Those tariffs could raise the costs of a car by thousands of dollars.
I'm looking at something to help some of the car companies where they're switching to parts that were made in Canada, Mexico, and other places, and they need a little bit of time because they're going to make them here, but they need a little bit of time. So I'm talking about things like that.
This comes after the U.S. removed smartphones and other electronics from its tariffs on China over the weekend. Meanwhile, China's President Xi Jinping met with Vietnam's top leader To Lam in Hanoi Monday to discuss establishing stronger ties on trade and supply chains amid disruptions caused by U.S. duties. They also signed dozens of cooperation agreements between the two communist-run nations.
I don't blame China. I don't blame Vietnam. I see their meeting today. Is that wonderful? That's a lovely meeting. They're meeting, like trying to figure out how do we screw the United States of America.
The visit, which had been planned for weeks, comes as Beijing faces 145% tariffs from Trump. Vietnam is negotiating a reduction of threatened U.S. tariffs of 46% that would otherwise apply in July after a global pause expires.
U.S. President Donald Trump's administration announced on Monday it was freezing $2.3 billion in federal funding to Harvard. The move came hours after the university rejected numerous demands from the Department of Education, which Harvard President Alan Garber wrote in a letter would allow the federal government to, quote, control the Harvard community and threaten the school's values. The funding freeze comes after the Trump administration said last month it was reviewing $9 billion in federal contracts and grants to Harvard. That's part of a crackdown on what it says is anti-Semitism that erupted on college campuses during pro-Palestinian protests over the past 18 months. The administration has already frozen hundreds of millions of dollars in federal funding for numerous universities. It's pressing institutions to make policy changes, citing what it says is a failure to fight anti-Semitism on campus.
Turn around.
Deportation proceedings have begun against some detained foreign students who took part in pro-Palestinian demonstrations, while visas for hundreds of other students have been canceled. In a letter on Friday, the Education Department stated that Harvard had, quote, failed to live up to both the intellectual and civil rights conditions that justify federal investment. Harvard agreed in January to provide additional protections for Jewish students. And Garber said in his letter that while the university is taking steps to address anti-Semitism on campus, quote, these ends will not be achieved by assertions of power unmoored from the law to control teaching and learning at Harvard and to dictate how we operate. To ease any funding crunch created by a cutoff in federal funding, Harvard is working to borrow $750 million from Wall Street.
More than 3 years after Russia's invasion of Ukraine, Europe's energy security is fragile. US liquefied natural gas helped plug the Russian supply gap in Europe during the energy crisis of 2 to 3 years ago. But since then, President Donald Trump has rocked relations with Europe by turning to energy as a bargaining chip in trade negotiations. Businesses are wary that reliance on the US has become a vulnerability. Against this backdrop, executives at some major EU firms have begun to say what would have been unthinkable a year ago. They believe importing some Russian gas could be a good idea. Leuna Chemical Park hosts one of Germany's biggest chemical clusters. The country relied heavily on cheap Russian gas until the Ukraine war. Christoph Gunther is managing director of Infra Leuna.
There are initial peace negotiations driven by the American government. So there is a chance that the guns will fall silent. It would then be important and sensible for all sides to return to the supply of natural gas via the pipelines. That would be an important incentive for Russia in the peace negotiations.
Any such move would require another major policy shift for the EU. It pledged to end Russian energy imports by 2027 after Moscow invaded Ukraine. But Europe has limited options and talks with LNG giant Qatar for more gas have stalled. And while the deployment of renewables has accelerated, the rate isn't fast enough to allow the EU to feel secure. US gas covered just over 16% of EU imports last year, behind Norway with around a third and Russia at just under 19%. Moscow's share will drop below a tenth this year after Ukraine shut pipelines. While a return of Russian gas appeals to some executives, it worries Maxim Timchenko, who is chief of Ukraine's private gas company DTEK. The firm hopes to import US LNG into Ukraine's storage and export it to Europe. Timchenko is quoted as saying it's hard to comment, but his hope is that European politicians learned their lessons dealing with Russia.
As Sudan marks 2 years of war, famine is growing. That's according to the World Food Program, which says decreasing global funding resources are complicating the hunger situation at a dire time. Sean Hughes is the agency's Sudan Regional Emergency Coordinator.
Sudan has now become the world's largest hunger crisis. Nearly half the population are acutely food insecure. Famine has taken hold in parts of Darfur and is spreading.
Hughes says food alone won't stop famine. Sudan also needs healthcare, water, and sanitation, basic needs that haven't been met due to a decline in aid funding and trouble accessing people who were isolated by the conflict.
So the whole response needs to be well supported in order to be able to turn this around and stem the tide of famine.
The World Food Program in March warned that 58 million people were at risk of extreme hunger or starvation unless urgent funding is secured after drastic shortfalls from donors so far this year, including the U.S. Famine conditions have been reported in at least 5 locations in Sudan, including displacement camps in Darfur, a UN statement said earlier this year.
Pop star Katy Perry and 5 other trailblazing women soared into the sky Monday aboard a Blue Origin rocket, marking the first all-female spaceflight in over 6 decades. The star-studded crew comprised Jeff Bezos' fiancée, Lauren Sanchez, CBS host